Hospitals have a particular stillness after midnight, a silence so unnatural it hums beneath the fluorescent lights. When I arrived at St. Mercy Hospital, the automatic doors groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, antiseptic air. The receptionist at the front desk didn't look up from her screen, her fingers gliding over the keyboard with an eerie, mechanical precision. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sick, at least not in the conventional sense. But something had drawn me here, an overwhelming compulsion that I couldn't explain. The waiting room was empty. No nurses wheeling patients through the hallways. No hushed murmurs of visitors. Just rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor and a flickering television in the corner, playing an infomercial on loop. The walls, painted an artificial shade of beige, seemed to press inward the longer I sat. A distant beep echoed from an unseen machine, a mechanical heartbeat for the hospital itself. Name? The receptionist's voice startled me. She hadn't looked up. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the pale reflection of her glasses catching the glow of the screen. I opened my mouth, but I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I had woken up with the sudden and absolute certainty that I needed to be here? That something inside this building was waiting for me? I don't know, I admitted. The receptionist finally lifted her head. Her face was smooth, expressionless. Her skin so waxy, it looked like it had been sculpted from candlelight. Room 6A, she said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. I hadn't filled out any paperwork. I hadn't even explained why I was here. But the moment my fingers brushed the clipboard, a jolt shot up my arm. A name was already written on the admission form. My name. I dropped the clipboard as if it had burned me, but the receptionist was already turning away. The hallway leading deeper into the hospital stretched before me, a long tunnel of flickering lights and doorways that swallowed the walls in darkness. At the end of the corridor, a single door stood ajar. Room 6A. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I walked. Each step seemed to stretch time, making the hallway feel impossibly long. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of something metallic and stale. My pulse pounded against my temples. When I reached the door, I pressed my palm against it. The wood was ice cold. Inside, the room was empty. No patient, no bed, just an old metal gurney with a single white sheet draped over it. And beneath the sheet, a shape, a body. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the sheet. Something inside me screamed not to do it, but I had no choice. I pulled it back, and I saw myself. Not just a body that resembled me, it was me. The same features, the same clothes I was wearing at that moment. Eyes closed, skin pale, lips slightly parted as if whispering something I couldn't hear. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, my breath strangled in my throat. Then, in the silence, my own voice whispered from the gurney, "You shouldn't be here." For a long moment, I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my chest. My fingers still curled around the edge of the sheet. The body, my body, lay motionless on the gurney, but the whisper still echoed in my ears. My own voice, warning me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the tiled floor. My shadow stretched unnaturally across the room, as if the light bent around me in ways it shouldn't. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. How could I be standing here while lying lifeless on that table? A shuffling sound in the hallway snapped me from my trance. I turned sharply, expecting a nurse, a doctor, anyone to explain this nightmare. But what I saw was worse. A patient stood in the doorway. A hospital gown hung loosely from their thin frame, their bare feet stark against the cold tile. Their face was turned away, chin tucked into their chest, arms limp at their sides. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at nothing. Another sound. A second patient appeared beside them, identical in posture, in silence. Then a third, a fourth. They emerged from the shadows of the hallway, their pale skin almost translucent under the artificial light. None of them met my gaze. None of them acknowledged me. I stumbled back, my heels striking the gurney. The body beneath the sheet, my body was gone. The sheet lay flat, untouched, as if it had never been disturbed in the first place. My stomach churned, my skin burned with the urge to run. One of the patients, the first one, twitched, a slight, involuntary jerk of their hand. Then another movement. Their head tilted, just enough for me to see the corner of their mouth. It was pulled into a wide, unnatural grin. "Hello." My voice cracked. No response. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding. Their heads snapped toward me in unison. Every single one of them. Their eyes were open now, but there was nothing behind them. No pupils, no color, just hollow, gaping voids where eyes should be. The silence was unbearable. Then, as if on cue, they moved, not toward me, but past me. They shuffled into room 6A, forming a perfect circle around the empty gurney. Their heads bowed in synchrony, as though in prayer. My breath came fast and shallow, my legs twitching with the urge to flee. And then, just as soundlessly as they had come, they lay down, one by one, curling into fetal positions on the cold floor, their vacant eyes still open. I bolted from the room. I ran. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, as if the hospital had expanded while I wasn't looking. My breath came in ragged gasps, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the sterile silence. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting warped shadows against the walls. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out before something even worse happened. But where was I supposed to go? My mind clung to logic, to reason, but neither belonged in St. Mercy Hospital. This place didn't operate by the rules of the real world. I had seen my own body on that gurney. I had watched silent patients lie down as if preparing for something beyond sleep. And yet, the hallways remained empty, devoid of nurses, doctors, or any sign of life except the ones I had already encountered. I forced myself to stop, pressing a shaking hand against the wall. I needed answers. There had to be records, files, charts, something that explained what was happening here. Hospitals kept track of every patient, every room, every admission. If I had somehow been admitted without my knowledge, there had to be a record of it. The reception desk was out of the question. I had no intention of speaking to the wax-faced woman at the front. Instead, I turned down a side hallway, searching for an administrative office or a nurse's station. The air was colder here, thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something rancid metallic like old blood. At the end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar. No label, no nameplate, just an empty white doorframe leading into a dark room. My pulse pounded against my skull, but I forced myself forward, my fingers grazing the edge of the door as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was bathed in dim, artificial light. Filing cabinets lined the walls, drawers slightly open, as if someone had been searching through them in a hurry. A single desk sat in the center of the room, littered with folders, loose sheets of paper, and a flickering computer monitor. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the documents for anything that might explain why I was here. I found nothing. There were patient charts, but the names were missing. Entire sections of the documents had been blacked out with thick, inky smudges, as though the information had been erased after being printed. The dates made no sense. Some were marked decades into the future. Others listed admissions from before the hospital was even built. And then I saw it, a single file resting on the desk, untouched. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, my name printed neatly across the front. I flipped it open. The first page was blank. So was the second. And the third. I flipped through faster, my breath quickening. The entire file was empty. No diagnosis, no history, no record of me at all. Then, as if responding to my discovery, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the small office like a gunshot. My breath hitched, my fingers frozen over the blank pages of my file. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, some rational explanation for the noise, but the doorway was empty. I took a slow step forward, my heartbeat a steady drum in my ears. The doorknob felt ice-cold beneath my palm as I turned it, locked. My stomach clenched. There had been no key, no mechanism to lock it from the outside. Someone or something had shut me in. The computer monitor flickered violently, static crawling across the screen like ants. Then, as if on command, a single phrase appeared in black, blocky text. "Do not turn around." The word sent a spike of ice through my spine. My breathing shallowed, my body frozen in place. The computer hummed softly, as if waiting for me to obey or disobey. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't real. It had to be some sick joke. The hospital had been abandoned, the records room untouched except for my empty file. There was no one behind me. There couldn't be, but I felt it, a presence, a shift in the air just beyond my shoulder. No breath, no sound, only the sensation of being watched, like something just out of sight, lingering, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The screen flickered again, the words changing. "If you see it, IT sees you." I clenched my jaw, my hands shaking as I reached for the desk without turning around. The papers crinkled under my fingers. Maybe there was something I had missed, something that would tell me what was happening. Then I saw it, a second door. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The room had only one entrance, the one I had come through. But now, across the filing cabinets, a narrow metal door stood slightly ajar, revealing a strip of complete darkness beyond. A choice: turn around and risk seeing what I wasn't supposed to see, or go through the door that shouldn't exist. I moved before I could think, before I could let my fear decide for me. My feet carried me to the second door, my hands pushing it open without hesitation. The darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was an absence of everything. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the world behind me collapsed into silence. The hum of the computer, the rustling of papers, even the distant flicker of the fluorescent lights, all gone. It was as if I had stepped into a void where sound itself had been devoured. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each one feeling muffled, like I was trapped underwater. I reached out, my fingers brushing against cold, damp walls on either side. A hallway, narrow, suffocating, and leading deeper into the unknown. I turned, expecting to see the faint outline of the records room behind me. But the door was gone. Not closed, gone. I pressed my palm against the wall where it had been. But there was nothing but solid, unyielding concrete. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down. There was no way back. The only way was forward. Step by step, I moved blindly through the corridor, my heartbeat the only sound in this swallowing silence. The walls felt uneven beneath my fingertips, as if they were shifting, breathing. I could almost swear they pulsed beneath my touch, like something alive. Then, faintly a new sensation, a breeze. Cold and stale, drifting from somewhere ahead. I wasn't alone in here. Something else was breathing, too. I swallowed hard and pressed forward, my hands guiding me through the darkness. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time felt meaningless in this place. My legs burned from walking, but there was no end in sight. Just more suffocating blackness. And then I felt it. Not air, not walls, flesh. My fingers grazed something warm and slick, and my body seized with revulsion. I yanked my hand back, my pulse hammering in my ears. But the moment I recoiled, the hallway changed. The silence cracked. A whisper. Not words, just breath. Right next to my ear. I turned sharply, my eyes straining in the pitch-black corridor. And that's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, blinking open all at once, lining the walls like grotesque, watching lanterns. Their pupils contracted in the darkness, locking onto me with eerie synchronization. And then, for the first time, the hallway made a sound. It exhaled. The floor beneath me lurched, and I fell forward, into the open mouth waiting below. Falling felt endless. There was no impact, no ground rushing up to meet me, only a sensation of being pulled. The darkness swallowed me whole, wrapping around my body like liquid shadow. I tried to scream, but the sound was stolen from my throat before it could leave my lips. The air was thick, pressing against my chest, forcing itself into my lungs like smoke. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. I didn't hit the ground. I simply was somewhere else. The darkness receded, peeling away like ink dissolving in water, revealing a new space. I was no longer in the hallway, no longer in the hospital. The air was different here, damp and tinged with the scent of something rotting. I was standing in a vast, circular chamber. The walls were impossibly high, curving upward into nothingness. Their surface was slick, pulsing, alive. They resembled muscle and sinew, as if I had been swallowed into the belly of some monstrous thing. Faint, rhythmic beats vibrated through the walls, like the distant echo of a heartbeat. I wasn't alone. Scattered across the chamber were hospital beds, arranged in a haphazard, chaotic pattern. Some were upright, others overturned, their thin mattresses torn apart. And each bed was occupied. Figures lay beneath the blood-stained sheets, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes. Their faces were hidden, shrouded in gauze and bandages that pulsed like breathing skin. Some twitched violently, as if trapped in an endless nightmare. Others were too still. A faint, mechanical hum filled the air, and I turned toward its source. In the center of the room stood in four-pole, tubes snaking from its base and disappearing into the floor. A thick black fluid dripped from the hanging four bag, seeping through the tubes and into the veins of the motionless patients. I stepped back, my stomach twisting. The beds, the figures, the tubes. It felt like a perversion of a hospital ward, like someone had built a replica of suffering. Then, the worst part, as I stood frozen, one of the patients turned its head. Slowly, deliberately. The bandages covering its face split, the flesh underneath peeling away like paper. And then, beneath the gauze, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. It was me, my own face staring back, eyes wide and hollow, lips moving soundlessly, skin ashen and cracked like porcelain ready to shatter. And then, without warning, it smiled. I couldn't move. The thing wearing my face stared at me, its lips stretched into a grotesque smile that didn't belong to me. It was wrong, all wrong. My own features twisted, warped into something alien, something that shouldn't exist outside of a nightmare. The other patients remained still, their bandages rising and falling with slow, unnatural breaths. The four tubes pulsed, the thick black fluid continuing its slow descent into their veins. But this version of me was awake. It sat up. I stumbled backward, my breath sharp and ragged. The sheets fell away from its body, revealing a skeletal frame beneath a hospital gown identical to mine. Its fingers twitched, curling and uncurling, as if testing their movement for the first time. "Where are you going?" The voice wasn't mine, but it should have been. It came from deep within its throat, layered with a static hum, like an old recording that had been warped and distorted. I opened my mouth to scream, to deny, but no sound came out. The thing swung its legs over the edge of the bed, standing with the slow, deliberate motion of a marionette. Its movements were too smooth, too controlled, like it wasn't used to having a body, but was learning. "You shouldn't be here," it said, tilting its head. The smile never faltered. "You left the door open." A sharp, electric fear shot through my spine. The door. I hadn't noticed it before, but behind me, a doorway gaped open. Not the one I had fallen through. This one was different. Tall, narrow, and wrong. A jagged tear in reality, leading somewhere deeper, somewhere worse. The thing took a step toward me. I turned and ran. The floor beneath me wasn't solid. It writhed soft and shifting, like running on flesh. My feet sank slightly with every step, the pulse beneath me growing louder. The chamber wasn't just alive. It was waking up. Behind me, the thing that looked like me whispered in that same warped voice. "You can't run from yourself." I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I threw myself through the doorway, into whatever lay beyond. And the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut behind me was my own laughter, except it wasn't coming from me. I landed hard, my knees scraping against the cold, linoleum floor. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled my bones, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just a blank hospital wall, sterile, and unremarkable. The warped chamber, the 4 tubes, the twisted thing wearing my face, all of it was gone. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. But then I looked around. I was back in the hospital. At least, it looked like the hospital. The walls were the same off-white. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. But something was off. The colors were muted, like the entire world had been drained of its vibrancy. The hallway stretched in both directions, longer than I remembered, with doors lining either side, each identical, each closed. I pushed myself up, my palms stinging from the impact. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body still trembling from the encounter with whatever that thing was. I needed to find a way out. I took a hesitant step forward. The floor beneath me felt solid, but when I walked, my footsteps didn't echo. They didn't make any sound at all. The hallway absorbed noise the same way the dark corridor had. It was unnatural, unsettling, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. I tried the first door to my right. Locked. The second. Locked. The third. It opened with an agonizingly slow creak, breaking the oppressive silence. I peered inside. It was a patient room, identical to the ones in the real hospital. A single bed sat against the far wall, crisp white sheets folded neatly. A heart monitor stood beside it, its screen blank, its wires dangling uselessly. The window, covered by thin white curtains, showed nothing. No buildings, no streetlights, just an endless gray void. Then I saw the clipboard. It rested on a small table near the bed, its paper yellowed and curling at the edges. I stepped forward cautiously, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, like it had been scrawled in a rush. Patient number 438. Do not wake up. I dropped the clipboard. The bed creaked. A slow, dragging sound filled the room as the sheets shifted, bunching and writhing as if something underneath was moving. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my legs threatening to collapse beneath me. And then the sheets slid away, revealing the patient beneath. It was me, pale, motionless, my chest barely rising with each breath. My eyes were closed, my face peaceful, too peaceful. It was as if I was asleep, untouched by the horrors of this place. But the heart monitor beside me flickered to life. A single, slow beep, then another, and then, in a whisper so faint I barely heard it. Wake up! The whisper slithered through the room, curling around me like a breath of cold air. Wake up! It was my own voice, but distant, as though spoken from a place just beyond the veil of reality. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The version of me lying in the bed remained still, his breathing impossibly shallow. The heart monitor emitted a slow, rhythmic beep, the only sound in the suffocating silence. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to see this. My trembling hand reached for the clipboard I had dropped, as if rereading the message would somehow change it. Patient number 438. Do not wake up. What did it mean? Was I asleep? Trapped? Dead? The figure in the bed stirred. I froze. The motion was subtle, a slight twitch of the fingers, a faint crease forming between his brows. But it was enough. My stomach twisted, every instinct screaming at me to run. The sheets rustled as his head turned, just slightly, toward me. His eyelids fluttered. I bolted for the door, but the second I reached it, the handle vanished. My breath hitched. I pressed my palms against the smooth, unbroken surface where the handle should have been. Nothing, just cold metal, solid and unmoving. I was trapped. Behind me, the heart monitor quickened. Beep, beep, beep. I didn't want to turn around. I had to turn around. The patient, myself, was sitting up now. His breathing was deeper, stronger. His head tilted toward me, and this time his eyes opened. They were black, not just dark, not just shadowed, but utterly, impossibly black. As if behind them, there was nothing. You're not supposed to be awake, he whispered. His lips curled into a grin, but the expression held no warmth, no humanity. That makes two of us. The heart monitor flatlined. The lights flickered. And then the room was not a room anymore. The walls peeled away like skin stripped from bone, revealing something deeper, something older than the hospital itself. The floor beneath me sagged and cracked, alive and pulsing. The other me lunged, and then I was falling, swallowed by the space that should not exist. I didn't hit the ground. The sensation of falling was replaced by a strange weightlessness, as if I were suspended in a void that refused to acknowledge the laws of physics. My body floated through an endless, black expanse, unable to move, unable to scream. The air, if you could even call it air, was thick, dense, and tasted of something metallic. I couldn't tell which direction I was falling. There was no sense of up or down, no sound, only the suffocating emptiness that pressed in from all sides. The world was silent. At least it should have been, but in the periphery of my mind, I could hear something. Faint at first, like a whisper drifting in from a distant corner. Then clearer, louder. Laughter. The same laughter I had heard earlier, echoing in the chamber where the other me, the thing, had grinned at me with eyes as black as the void itself. The laughter was mine. I forced my eyes shut, hoping to block out the sound, but it only grew louder until it was no longer just a sound but a presence. The laughter was a weight, pressing down on me, filling the space around me. It was cold, unnervingly so, and it wasn't just my own. There was another layer to it, something beneath the surface, a mockery, a twisted echo of my voice, distorted and wrong. Did you really think you could escape? The voice was no longer a whisper, but a full-on taunt, vibrating in the emptiness. My chest tightened with fear, my limbs frozen. Did you really think there's a way out? I opened my eyes again, and this time, the void responded. A figure began to form in front of me, coalescing from the shadows as if drawn from the fabric of the nothingness itself. It took shape, my shape, but it was wrong. It was too tall, too thin. The skin stretched too tightly over the bones, making the figure appear almost skeletal. The smile, that same grotesque smile, spread across its face, but it wasn't just a smile. It was an expression of mockery, of absolute contempt. The eyes were those same void-black pits, and they burned through me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. You can't outrun yourself, you know. The figure's voice was eerily calm, too calm, as though it was speaking from the very depths of the abyss. You left me behind, and now we're going to make you stay. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't fight, couldn't even blink. The fear that had been eating away at me for what felt like hours, days, months, it consumed me entirely. The figure stepped closer, its footfalls silent against the nothingness, yet the weight of its presence was crushing, suffocating. You think you're the only one who's trapped? The figure's grin widened impossibly. This place is mine. It remembers me. It remembers you. And then the world shifted. The void was replaced by something else, the hospital. But this wasn't the sterile, cold place it had been before. The walls were peeling, the floor cracked open in places like veins. There was no light, only shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally, as if the very air was alive, crawling, waiting. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights was replaced by a constant, dissonant ringing, a tone that gnawed at my nerves. In the distance, I could hear voices, screams, and then, from behind me, a figure appeared, one I recognized instantly. The thing from the bed, the one wearing my face. It was standing at the doorway, grinning that same horrible grin. But there was something different now. It was no longer just a reflection of me, but something more. It was an imprint of me, something that had been shaped, twisted, and left behind. You can't outrun what's inside you, it whispered, its voice sending a chill up my spine. You left a part of yourself here, and it won't let you go. I turned to run again, but the room twisted and morphed, bending and stretching like rubber. The walls closed in on me, the ceiling lowering with every step I took. No matter how far I went, there was no escape. The laughter followed me, and in that laugh, I realized something. It wasn't just the hospital that remembered. It was me. The walls of the hospital had grown alive, pulsating with a rhythm of their own. The shadows moved like tendrils, slithering from cracks and corners, creeping across the floor, as if trying to draw me back to the very heart of this place, to the bed. I could feel the weight of their gaze, a presence more unsettling than the haunting laughter that followed me through the corridors. It was as though the hospital itself, this thing I had once trusted a place for healing, had become a living entity, its desire to consume me overwhelming every rational thought. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, constricted by an unseen force. Every step forward seemed to draw me deeper into its grasp. I turned another corner, hoping for an exit, but instead I found myself face to face with an old, familiar hallway. It was as if time had reset, looping me back to where it all began. The very same hallway where I had first walked in, anxious and unsure, seeking treatment. Yet now, it was a trap, each door leading to another impossibility, another nightmare. I froze in front of a familiar door. Room 301. My own hospital room, the one where I had woken up after the procedure. The room where I had first met Dr. Jensen. The room where I had first realized something was wrong. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, unsure of what awaited on the other side. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, knowing that I was no longer the same person who had once entered this space. The room had changed. The sterile white walls were now stained with a deep, sickly yellow. The bed was no longer pristine, the sheets torn and frayed, the metal frame twisted in unnatural angles. The heart monitor beside the bed flickered erratically, its beeping warped and distorted, almost as if the machine itself had become sentient, reflecting the chaos within the room. And there, in the corner of the room, was the same figure I had seen before. The twisted reflection of myself, its hollow eyes staring through me, as though seeing straight into my soul. It grinned that same grin, wide and mocking, as if it found my presence here both amusing and inevitable. "You came back," it said, its voice dripping with a cruel amusement. "Did you think you could outrun me? You left, but I stayed. I'm always here." I stumbled backward, trying to steady myself against the wall. The laughter echoed again, louder now, the sound filling the room like an oppressive fog. But then, just as I was about to turn and flee, I heard another voice, a voice I recognized. "Is everything okay?" Dr. Jensen. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat. There he was standing in the doorway, his lab coat immaculate, his expression calm and professional, just as it had been when we first met. The same reassuring smile on his face. But there was something wrong, something off about the way he stood there. His eyes were too still, too blank, as if he were no longer human, but an empty vessel, a shell of the man I had once trusted. "Dr. Jensen?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What's happening? What is this place?" He didn't respond at first. His eyes flickered, as if struggling to focus. And then, in a voice that was both far too calm and disturbingly hollow, he said, "This is where you belong." I shook my head, disoriented. "No, this isn't real. I don't belong here. I need to leave. I have to leave." He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The room seemed to shrink around me as he approached, and I realized with a sudden jolt of fear that the hallway outside was no longer visible. The door had disappeared, leaving me trapped once again in this twisted version of the hospital. "You don't understand," Dr. Jensen continued, his voice growing softer. "You've always been here. This place, this hospital, it remembers you. It needs you." The walls closed in tighter, the shadows thickening, and I realized with a chilling certainty that I wasn't just trapped in a hospital. I was trapped in a memory. This was not a place for healing. It was a prison built on a foundation of forgotten truths, where the past bled into the present, and I could never escape. The laughter returned, louder now, mingling with Dr. Jensen's words, drowning out everything else. And as I looked into his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, I understood. The man I had once trusted was not here to help me. He was another piece of this endless nightmare, a reflection of the truth I had been trying to ignore. There was no way out. I had never left. The weight of Dr. Jensen's words lingered in the air like a suffocating fog, and the oppressive silence that followed only deepened the horror of my realization. I had never left. I had been caught in this twisted labyrinth, a loop of memories and nightmares designed to keep me confined in a prison of my own making. I could feel my pulse quickening as I tried to make sense of the impossible. The walls were no longer just physical boundaries. They were the limits of my understanding, the edges of my very existence. Dr. Jensen took another step closer, his presence suffocating in its calmness. He was no longer the doctor I had once trusted, but an agent of the hospital's perverse will. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The room was closing in on me, the shadows thickening as if they had weight, as if they were alive and reaching for me. I could hear the faint rustling of something behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the same empty walls, the same sterile bed that no longer felt like a place of recovery, but a tomb. You don't understand, do you? Dr. Jensen's voice was now a low murmur, his tone almost sympathetic. You never left because this place, this hospital, isn't a physical location. It's a state of being, a reflection of what you are, what you've always been. I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to piece together what he was saying. What did he mean? How could this be? I had walked through the doors, seen patients, interacted with nurses, and left after my procedure. I had been discharged. I had walked away. But now, none of that seemed real. The more I tried to understand, the more the reality around me warped and twisted, as though the very fabric of time had unraveled. This is your truth, Dr. Jensen continued, his voice now a whisper, almost conspiratorial. You came here, but you never truly left because you've never confronted what's inside you. You came to the hospital seeking healing, but what you needed was not physical. It was far deeper than that. You needed to face your fears, your mistakes, your guilt. He paused, and I saw a flicker of something that wasn't quite right in his eyes. And you've been running from it ever since. The word struck me like a slap to the face. Guilt. What was he talking about? I had come here because of a medical issue, not because of some dark, hidden truth that I had to confront. But as the room around me began to pulse and bend, I realized there was more to this than just the hospital. There was something inside me, something I had buried deep within, something I had been trying to forget. The shadows began to twist, forming shapes, silhouettes that flickered at the edges of my vision. They were familiar, though I couldn't quite place them. Faces, features, all distorted and alien. I reached for my head, pressing my palms against my temples as if trying to force away the images. But they kept coming, relentless and invasive. You've been running from yourself, Dr. Jensen said again, and this time, his voice wasn't soothing. It was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. You think the hospital is keeping you trapped, but it's not. You are keeping yourself here. The room seemed to shift again, and I was no longer standing in the sterile confines of room 301. I was somewhere else now, somewhere dark and suffocating. I recognized the place, though it seemed warped, discolored, as if through a broken lens. The hospital corridors stretched on forever, and the lights above flickered erratically, casting long, creeping shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the distance, I could hear the faintest sound of someone crying, but it was muffled, distant, almost as if it were coming from another time. I turned around, and there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was another figure. This time, it wasn't Dr. Jensen, nor the twisted reflection of myself. It was someone else, someone familiar, a woman with dark, messy hair, her face obscured by a veil of shadows. But there was no mistaking her. It was Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. Sarah was the one person I had left behind, the one person who had begged me to confront the darkness I carried inside. She had been my partner once, before everything had fallen apart. She had been the one to ask me the questions I didn't want to answer, the ones that tore at the very core of my existence. Sarah, my voice trembled. Is that you? The figure didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow. Something in the way she moved, the way the shadows clung to her, pulled me toward her like a magnet. But as I walked toward her, the distance between us never seemed to shorten. The hallway stretched endlessly, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror, warping and distorting with every step. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to the empty space between us, the words heavy with the weight of years of unanswered questions. Her figure faltered, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief moment of humanity that sent a shiver down my spine. But just as quickly, the shadows overtook her again, and she was lost to them. The hallway stretched even further, and I felt myself being pulled into the abyss. No, I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding. The truth was finally becoming clear. This hospital, this nightmare, was not just a place of confinement. It was a place where I had to confront the truth I had buried so deep I didn't even know it existed. And until I did, I would never escape. The silence that enveloped me after Sarah vanished was a cruel reminder that I was alone in this distorted reality. The hallway continued to stretch into infinity, an oppressive labyrinth designed not to lead me to freedom, but to trap me in my own mind. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it too was a part of the puzzle, a part of the nightmare I had failed to wake from. My heart beat loudly in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the hollow emptiness. I couldn't run anymore. Every attempt to move forward, every step, only seemed to lengthen the distance between me and the answers I so desperately needed. There was no going back. I had already been made to face the inescapable truth that this hospital, this strange construct, was more than just a place. It was a prison of my own creation. The past, the mistakes I had ignored and buried for so long, had come to the surface. They were no longer things I could avoid or shove aside. The guilt I had tried to outrun had found me, and now it demanded to be acknowledged. I turned back toward the darkness, the spot where Sarah had disappeared. Her face, or what was left of it, flashed before my eyes again. It was her, but it wasn't. The shadows had consumed her, just as they had consumed everything else in this twisted version of reality. I had always known there was something I was running from, but now I understood. It wasn't just the mistakes I had made with Sarah. It wasn't just the guilt of abandoning her when she needed me the most. It was the fear of confronting the fact that I had never truly dealt with the trauma of our relationship. I had buried it beneath layers of denial and self-deception, and it had festered in the darkness until it had become a living, breathing thing. "Why didn't you stay?" The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. They were an accusation, a question I had asked myself over and over in my waking life. I hadn't stayed for Sarah when she needed me to fight for us. I hadn't stayed for her when she was drowning in her own pain. Instead, I had walked away, thinking it would be easier to erase the past than to face it. The hallway seemed to constrict around me, and I could feel the walls closing in. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the very building itself was reacting to my internal turmoil. It was then that I realized this place wasn't just a hospital. It was a manifestation of everything I had suppressed, every unhealed wound I had tried to ignore. Each room, each hallway, each shadow was a reflection of my unresolved grief, regret, and fear. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, startling me. I whirled around, but there was nothing, only the emptiness, only the oppressive stillness. The footsteps stopped as quickly as they had begun, and the silence returned. But I knew I wasn't alone. There was something here, something that wasn't human, something that existed in the space between memories and nightmares. The walls shimmered briefly, like a mirage in the desert, before they solidified again. I blinked, and in that fleeting moment, the hospital vanished. I was no longer in the sterile, dim-lit corridors. I was standing outside, in the middle of a barren field. The sky was a sickly shade of green, and the ground beneath my feet was cracked and dry. It was a place that shouldn't exist, a place that couldn't exist. But here it was, stretching out before me like a wasteland of my own making. And there, standing in the distance, was Sarah once more. This time, her face was clearer, her features sharper, but the shadows still clung to her, like a veil of darkness she couldn't escape. She didn't look at me. She just stood there, staring into the abyss, as though waiting for something. Waiting for me. I started toward her, my steps heavy and reluctant. The closer I got, the more the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth was shifting in response to my presence. I reached out, calling her name, but no sound left my lips. It was as though I was trapped in a place beyond time, beyond sound, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. But then, she turned, her eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw the person I had once loved, the woman I had abandoned. The woman who had tried to save me, who had begged me to face the truth. And in that moment, I realized that I had never truly faced her. I had never faced what I had done to her. To us. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't a plea, but a simple truth. And in those words, I understood. I was still running. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of everything I had tried to avoid. I couldn't keep running from the past. I couldn't keep pretending that I was the victim in this story. The truth had always been within me, waiting to be unearthed. The pain, the guilt, the betrayal. It had all been buried, hidden in the recesses of my mind, but now it was here. It was real. It was undeniable. Sarah's figure began to fade, the shadows once again claiming her as she had been claimed before. I reached out, but she was already gone. The field, the sky, the ground. All of it began to dissolve around me, the fragments of my mind cracking and breaking like shattered glass. And in that final moment, as everything crumbled away, I understood. This was the confrontation I had been avoiding. This was the reckoning, and I couldn't run anymore. The fragments of my mind, still swirling from the encounter with Sarah, began to settle into a quiet hum. Yet, there was no peace in the silence. Only the sharp, lingering sensation that something was off, something still lay just beyond my understanding. The walls, once shifting and fluid, had solidified once more into the cold, sterile confines of the hospital. I was back, but it was no longer the same place I had wandered through before. The air felt thicker, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for me to acknowledge something I had failed to see. The shadows in the corners seemed more pronounced, more alive than before, watching, waiting. In that moment, I realized that the hospital was not merely a space within a distorted world. It was a mirror, a reflection of my fractured self, my fractured past. The deeper I ventured, the more it revealed. Each hallway, each door was not just a part of this place, but a part of my psyche, a part of the pain I had refused to confront. And though the memories continued to come at me in waves, I was still unsure whether I had the strength to face them. The shadows moved as if to taunt me, and I found myself following them down a corridor I had never seen before. The walls were stained with something dark, something I couldn't name, yet something I knew was intimately familiar. A feeling of dread curled at the edges of my mind, an unease I couldn't shake. Was it blood, or something worse? The scent in the air seemed to mingle with the stench of fear that I carried with me, a scent that clung to my skin no matter how hard I tried to scrub it off. I walked, one step after another, toward the door at the end of the hall. It was the only door in sight, and in the way things work here, I knew I had no choice but to approach it. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. What lay beyond? What new horror awaited me? As the door creaked open, I was met with a sight that made my heart stop. It wasn't another sterile room. It wasn't a place that looked like a hospital ward. Instead, it was a replica of the room I had shared with Sarah all those years ago. The familiar sight of the old furniture, the faded wallpaper, and the window that looked out onto the empty streets filled me with a sickening sense of nostalgia. But this wasn't the room I had left behind. This wasn't a simple memory. This was a nightmare, a distorted version of a past I could never escape. I stepped inside, my feet dragging on the carpet as if the very ground was holding me in place. The room was dark, save for a single, flickering light in the corner. It cast long, strange shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something I couldn't identify but knew was wrong. As I looked around, I saw her, Sarah, sitting on the bed with her back to me. Her presence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was as though I was caught in a dream, unable to break free. I tried to call out to her, to apologize for the years I had spent running from the truth, but my voice faltered. It was as if she was a ghost, a memory that had been etched into the very fabric of this place, this hospital, this nightmare. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable, her eyes distant. "You think you can come back now?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an accusation. "After everything, you think it's that easy?" I froze. The words felt like a slap across my face. In them I understood the depth of my failure, the years I had spent avoiding her, the decisions I had made to bury the past. I had thought I could outrun my mistakes, but the truth had always been there, waiting for me. I had always known the consequences of my actions, but facing them was another thing entirely. "I was wrong," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "I know I was, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix me." Sarah's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Then it turned cold again. "You're here now, but it's too late. You've already broken it beyond repair." The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing as the weight of her words pressed down on my chest. I could feel my breath shallow, panic creeping into the edges of my mind. This wasn't just a confrontation with her. It was a confrontation with everything I had avoided for years. The guilt, the shame, the loss. It was all here, in this room, waiting to suffocate me. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee from this place, from the reality that I had built around myself. But I couldn't. The door had disappeared. The room was the only thing that existed now. And in this moment, I understood that I couldn't escape. Not this time. I couldn't keep running from the consequences of my actions. I had to face them. I had to confront the part of me that had allowed this nightmare to continue for so long. With a trembling hand, I reached for Sarah, but as my fingers brushed against her arm, she dissolved into mist, fading away like a fleeting memory. The room, too, began to disintegrate, crumbling into dust as though it had never existed in the first place. I found myself back in the hallway, once again alone. The silence was deafening, but it no longer held the same terror it once had. I knew now that this place, this hospital, this nightmare, wasn't just a physical space. It was the reflection of the turmoil within me, the pain I had carried for too long. And though I had not yet found the way out, I understood that the journey was far from over. Each step forward would bring me closer to facing the truth and to finally freeing myself from the prison I had built. I had thought I understood the nature of this place, the hospital that seemed to shift with each passing hour, each change in my own mental state. I had thought I was simply navigating the labyrinth of my own subconscious, confronting the fragments of my past and the fractured pieces of my identity. But the further I delved into this hospital, the more I realized how mistaken I was. It wasn't just a manifestation of my psyche. It was a force of its own, a place that existed beyond my control. And it was trying to tell me something. But what? The hallway before me stretched endlessly, as it often did, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls were lined with faded posters that seemed to flicker as I passed them, the words barely legible. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay, a smell that seemed to have embedded itself into every surface. The atmosphere here was oppressive, the silence suffocating. It was as if the very building was waiting for something it couldn't quite express, but desperately wanted to. I knew that the deeper I ventured, the closer I would get to understanding whatever truth lay hidden in this place. But that truth had eluded me so far. I had encountered fragments, pieces of something larger, but none of it had made sense. Sarah, the room from my past, the strange encounters with the nurses, each event had added to the puzzle, but never quite fit into the larger picture. What was it all leading to? What was the hospital trying to tell me? It was then that I heard the voices. At first, they were faint whispers, indistinguishable from the hum of the building itself. But as I walked further, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were not just voices in the walls. They were voices from the past. My past. The words became more distinct, more urgent, and I realized, with a sudden jolt of realization, that they were speaking directly to me. Remember, the word was simple, but it resonated with an intensity that almost made my knees buckle. Remember what? What had I forgotten? I had been so focused on the present, so intent on understanding the hospital's twisted version of reality, that I hadn't considered what might be lying beneath the surface. The truth wasn't something I could simply stumble upon. It was something I had to actively seek, something I had buried so deep within myself that I had nearly forgotten it altogether. I pressed on, following the whispers, which seemed to guide me toward the end of the hall. There, at the farthest point, was a door, one I had not seen before. It was different from all the others. There were no faded signs, no indications of what lay beyond. The door was plain, unassuming, yet it felt like it held the answer to everything. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the handle and turned it. The room beyond was unlike any I had encountered so far. It was small, almost cramped, with walls that were lined with shelves full of old, dusty books. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper, a smell that almost felt comforting, despite the unease settling in my stomach. At the center of the room stood a desk, its surface cluttered with papers, photographs, and old medical records. But what caught my attention wasn't the desk. It was the figure standing beside it. It was a man dressed in a lab coat, his back to me. His posture was rigid, his movements stiff and controlled. He didn't seem to notice my presence, as though he were completely absorbed in whatever task he was performing. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. A sense of recognition prickled at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't quite grasp it. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man turned slowly, his face coming into view. He was older than I remembered, his features marked by time and wear. But it wasn't his age that stopped me in my tracks, it was his eyes. They were cold, empty, as though they had seen too much, as though they had lost all hope. And then, just as I thought I could no longer bear the weight of his gaze, he spoke. "I've been waiting for you." The words were simple, but their meaning struck me with the force of a blow. Waiting for me? How could he have been waiting for me? I had never seen him before, never known him, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about the way he said it. It was as though this meeting had been inevitable, as though it had been predestined from the very moment I entered this place. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're here because you've forgotten something. Something important. Something that you need to remember if you ever hope to leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. Leave? Was that even possible? I had come to believe that this place was a part of me, that it was an inescapable reality. But now, his words planted a seed of doubt. If I could leave, if there was a way out, then perhaps I wasn't as trapped as I had believed. "What do I need to remember?" I asked, my mind racing. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was not a comforting expression. "You already know the answer, but you've been running from it for too long. The truth is in the past, buried in the very place where you began your journey. You've been avoiding it, trying to outrun it. But there's no escape. Not anymore." His words sent a jolt of realization through me. The past, the beginning. I had been avoiding something I had long since buried. What was it? What was the truth I had refused to face? The answer was so close, I could almost taste it, but it was still just out of reach. With that, the man turned back to his desk, his attention returning to whatever task he had been working on. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. The room seemed to close in around me, and for the first time since I had entered the hospital, I felt truly lost. What was the truth I had been avoiding? And more importantly, why did it feel like the hospital itself was determined to make me face it? The man's words echoed in my mind as I left the small, cluttered room. The truth is in the past, buried in the very place where you began your journey. What could he have meant? I had been navigating the labyrinth of this hospital, trying to decipher its dark corners, but nothing had connected. The pieces were scattered, fragmented, almost unrecognizable. I had been searching for something elusive, something that felt just beyond my reach. But now, in the wake of that cryptic statement, I realized that perhaps the answers I was looking for were buried in the past, buried within the very thing I had been trying to escape. As I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, the oppressive air grew heavier, almost suffocating. It was as though the hospital was alive, breathing in rhythm with my every step, watching me as I moved forward. The walls seemed to press in on me, as if closing off all my options, guiding me toward the truth I had so desperately been avoiding. I knew that what lay ahead would force me to confront something I wasn't ready to face. But what choice did I have? The man had told me that there was no escape, not until I remembered. I stumbled upon a familiar hallway. It was the same one I had walked down many times before, but this time, something felt different. The flickering lights, the sterile scent of antiseptic, it all seemed too real, too immediate. I wasn't just walking through the hospital anymore. I was walking through memories, through pieces of a life I had tried to forget. The floor beneath my feet creaked, almost as if it were alive, responding to my every move. I realized then that this hospital was more than just a place. It was a reflection of me, a twisted mirror of my own subconscious. And within its walls, my past was waiting to be uncovered. As I continued down the corridor, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks, a door. It was old, weathered, as though it had been there for years, possibly even decades. But it wasn't just the appearance of the door that caught my attention. It was the faint glow emanating from beneath it, casting an eerie light in the otherwise dark hallway. The door seemed to beckon me, its presence undeniable. I had passed this door before, or at least I thought I had, but this time something about it felt different. Something inside me urged me to open it. With a trembling hand, I reached for the handle, my heart racing in my chest. The cold metal sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't hesitate. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with low ceilings and walls that seemed to close in around me. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. At first glance, it appeared to be an old storage room, filled with boxes and crates, all covered in layers of dust. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, there was a small, old-fashioned bed. It was covered with a faded sheet, and beside it sat a solitary chair. The room felt cold, abandoned, like no one had been here in years. I stepped closer to the bed. My curiosity piqued. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. As I reached out to touch the sheet, I felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over me. A memory, distant yet vivid, surged to the forefront of my mind. A child's laughter, a mother's voice, and then darkness. My breath caught in my throat as the memory twisted, distorted by the weight of time. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. What was this place? Why did it feel so familiar? This room, this bed, had I been here before? Was this the place where everything had started? A small part of me wanted to turn and leave, to escape the overwhelming sense of dread that had suddenly filled the room. But the other part of me, the part that had been searching for answers, couldn't walk away. I had to know. I had to confront whatever this was. I approached the bed once more, my fingers trembling as I lifted the sheet. The bed was empty, but beneath the fabric, something caught my eye. A photograph. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed, but the image was still clear. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The photograph showed a woman, her face familiar yet distant. She was smiling, holding a child in her arms. I stared at the image, trying to place her, but the memory was hazy. The woman's face blurred, and the child. Was it me? Was I the child in the photograph? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The woman in the photo, the child in her arms, it all made sense now. This room, this hospital, it wasn't just a place of forgotten memories. It was a place where the past was trapped, locked away, and hidden, waiting for me to unlock it. The woman, the child, they were part of my story, part of a life I had buried deep within myself. I felt a sudden surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, confusion, and sorrow. What had happened here? Why had I forgotten? I had spent so long trying to understand this place, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. But now, in this room, I realized that the truth was not something I could simply discover. It was something I had to confront. The past wasn't just a series of disconnected memories. It was a part of who I was. And to move forward, to escape this place, I would have to face it head on. I placed the photograph back on the bed and turned to leave the room. The hallway outside felt different now, quieter, as though the hospital was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew one thing for certain. The past had been waiting for me all along. And now, I had no choice but to face it. The discovery of the photograph had left me shaken, yet there was no time to linger in my confusion. The memory of the woman and child in that faded picture seemed to haunt me, but I couldn't allow myself the luxury of dwelling in its grasp. The past was no longer something I could ignore. It was a specter that had come alive, pulling me deeper into its web. I had no choice now but to confront it, to understand what had happened, why I had been led here, and what I was truly searching for. But as I moved forward, something inside me warned that my quest for answers was not only dangerous, it was also something I had never truly prepared for. I left the storage room, my footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. The hospital, which had once seemed like a maze of sterile walls, now felt more like a prison. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, casting a harsh glow over everything they touched. I wondered for a moment how long I had been here, how much time had passed since I first arrived. Hours? Days? It was hard to tell. The hospital seemed to exist outside of time, each room and hallway blending into the next, each memory bleeding into the other. It was in that disorienting moment that I heard it, a soft whisper, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It was a voice, familiar yet distant, echoing through the empty hall. I froze, straining my ears to catch the words. The voice seemed to be calling me, beckoning me to follow. I felt a chill run down my spine, but curiosity, no, desperation, overpowered my fear. I had come this far. Whatever was ahead, I was already in too deep to turn back. I followed the whisper down the corridor, my footsteps tentative but urgent. The hospital seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, and the voice guided me through it, winding its way through the labyrinth of sterile walls and rooms. The closer I got, the more the voice seemed to take on a shape, a presence of its own. It was as if the hospital itself had become a living, breathing entity, drawing me in with the promise of revelation. But I knew better than to trust it. Everything about this place was designed to disorient, to confuse, to manipulate. Eventually, I arrived at a door that I recognized from the many times I had walked this hallway. It was an unremarkable door, nothing more than a simple wooden barrier that separated one room from another. Yet, as I approached, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the very air around me was charged with electricity, vibrating with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. I reached out for the doorknob, my heart racing in my chest. When I opened the door, I was met with an unsettling silence. The room inside was dark, its edges blurred by shadows that seemed to shift with the movement of my body. I hesitated, unsure whether to step inside. There was no turning back now, though. I had followed the voice to this point, and it was clear that this room held something crucial to understanding what was happening. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out the shapes within the room. It was a hospital room, though it was unlike any I had encountered so far. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, the kind that had long since been deemed obsolete. A bed sat in the center of the room, but it was empty, save for a thin sheet that covered its surface. Yet, the strangest part of the room was the large, cracked mirror that hung on the far wall. It was positioned in such a way that I couldn't help but stare into it as soon as I entered the room. In the reflection, I saw not just myself, but something else, a figure standing just behind me. It was a shadow, formless and dark, and yet I could feel its presence, its eyes upon me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was still there, just behind me. The reflection was somehow wrong, distorted in ways I couldn't understand. It was like looking at a fractured version of reality, a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. I stepped closer to the mirror, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch its surface. The cold glass sent a shiver up my spine, but I couldn't look away. I had to know. What was this? What was I seeing? As my fingers made contact with the glass, I felt a sudden pull, as if the mirror itself were alive, sucking me in. The world around me seemed to blur, and I stumbled backward, away from the mirror. My reflection remained, but the figure behind me grew clearer, its features slowly sharpening, revealing the face of the woman from the photograph. I gasped. It was her, the woman I had seen in the photograph, the one I had thought was part of a memory long buried. But how could she be here in this room, in this mirror? The room seemed to shift, the walls warping and bending as though the very space were being rewritten. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but it was no longer where I had left it. The room had changed. It felt like the very fabric of reality was unraveling around me. For a moment, I was consumed by fear, but then something else took hold, an overwhelming sense of realization. The hospital, the mirror, the whispering voice, they were all part of the same thing. This place was not just a hospital. It was a reflection of my mind, a manifestation of my deepest fears and repressed memories. The woman in the mirror, the child in the photograph, they were part of a story I had buried so deep within myself that I had forgotten it existed. But now, I had no choice but to remember. As I stood there, staring at my reflection, I realized that the only way out of this place was to confront the truth head-on. The mirror wasn't just showing me a memory. It was showing me a piece of myself that I had long since abandoned. It was a fragment of my past, a past that I couldn't outrun anymore. The hospital was not a place of healing. It was a place of reckoning. And now, it was time to face what had been waiting for me all along. The unsettling stillness of the room clung to me, suffocating and heavy, as I continued to stare at the mirror. The woman's face, so eerily familiar and yet so distant, stared back at me with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragmented memories that had led me here to this moment of horrifying realization. The room felt like it was closing in on me, as if the walls were constricting with every breath I took. I had thought that I had come to the hospital for answers, but now I wasn't sure I could handle what those answers might be. The voice, that same whispering presence I had followed through the halls, seemed to swirl around me, growing louder with each passing second. It was no longer a mere sound. It had become a feeling, a presence that hovered just behind me, brushing against my skin, urging me forward. I wanted to scream, to flee from the room, but my legs felt frozen, as though some invisible force was holding me in place. The reflection of the woman, her eyes now wide with sorrow, felt as though it was reaching out to me, pulling me into her world, into whatever dark place she inhabited. I couldn't help but wonder, who was she? What connection did she have to me, to my past, to the nightmare I was slowly unraveling? I had never seen her before, at least not consciously. Her face was not something I could place, but the feeling of familiarity gnawed at me, persistent and unrelenting. It was as though she had always been there, just beneath the surface of my memories, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The mirror wasn't just showing me an image. It was showing me a truth I was unwilling to confront. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling level. A sharp, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. Faint, like a door creaking open in the distance. The whispering intensified, filling the room, a chorus of voices now swirling around me. I could no longer tell if they were coming from the walls, the mirror, or my own mind. The boundaries between reality and delusion had begun to blur, and I found myself caught in the storm of it all. My heart pounded, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the woman in the reflection move. Her mouth parted as if to speak, but no sound escaped. In that moment, a sudden realization hit me. The woman wasn't just a victim, a prisoner of the hospital's twisted reality. No, she was something more. She was me. I had been staring into a mirror, not just reflecting my image, but reflecting my soul, my buried memories. The truth was painful to accept, but it was clear now that I was not just here to solve a mystery. I was here to confront a past I had long since tried to bury. The woman was a part of me, a part of my own history that had been locked away in the recesses of my mind. And now, it was demanding to be remembered. The whispering voices seemed to reach a fever pitch, their words growing more frantic, more urgent. The room was spinning, the walls undulating as though they were alive, pulsing with an energy that was almost suffocating. I stumbled backward, my body shaking, and I was aware that the room itself seemed to be shifting, its dimensions warping in impossible ways. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the woman in the mirror was no longer there. In her place was something else, something far darker. It was a man, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of pain and rage. His eyes were wide, bulging with madness, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. I felt my breath catch in my throat, panic rising like a tidal wave. This was not the woman I had seen before, but something far more sinister. His presence felt like a direct challenge, a confrontation that I was not prepared for. He seemed to reach out from the mirror, his fingers stretching toward me, as though he was trying to pull me into his world. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing in my ears. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I could feel the air closing in on me, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on my chest. The voices had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that rang in my ears. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. But just as quickly as the man had appeared, he vanished, leaving only the reflection of myself once more. But something was different now. My reflection was no longer just my own. It was distorted, twisted by an unseen force. I looked different, as though my face had been stretched, contorted into a grotesque version of itself. I recoiled in horror. The hospital room was no longer just a physical space. It had become a mirror of my psyche, a reflection of everything I had repressed, every secret I had buried deep within. The walls seemed to pulse with my fear, with my growing sense of unease. I realized that this hospital was not merely a place of healing or illness. It was a place where the past bled into the present, where the shadows of memory could manifest in the most terrifying ways. And the worst part was that I wasn't just a visitor here. I was part of it. I had always been part of it. I turned away from the mirror, unable to look at myself any longer. My reflection was no longer the only thing staring back at me. The woman, the man, these figures were not just illusions. They were me, fragments of a past I had long since tried to forget. But now, they had come for me, and I knew, deep in my gut, that there was no escape. I had come here seeking answers, but what I had found was something far more horrifying. The truth that had been buried deep within my own mind, waiting to resurface. The room, once so still, now seemed alive, as though it were breathing. The walls pressed in, the air thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. I knew now that I could not outrun this. The hospital was not just a place where memories were kept. It was a place where they were made real. And as I stood there, in the heart of the hospital, I realized that the true horror was not the things I had seen, but the things I had forgotten. And those forgotten things, those forgotten pieces of me, were now coming back to claim me. In the wake of the horrific realization that my own mind had betrayed me, the very air in the hospital seemed to change. The weight of the truth I had uncovered lingered like a thick fog, impossible to escape, wrapping around me with each step I took. The walls, once sterile and familiar, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy that fed on my fear. It wasn't just the mirror or the reflections. It was the hospital itself. The building had become something more, something alive. Every creaking floorboard, every flicker of dim lighting seemed to be alive with malevolent intent. I moved through the hallways mechanically, my mind still reeling from the strange visions I had witnessed. The reflections had been the first sign, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just a visitor in this place. The hospital was no longer merely a setting, it was a prison. The walls had a suffocating, confining presence, as if they were designed not to treat the sick, but to keep the guilty trapped within them. I had long since lost track of time, and the sterile hallways seemed to stretch on endlessly. I couldn't tell if the rooms I passed were real or part of my increasingly fragile mental state. The whispers, which had been a distant murmur before, were now full-blown voices, echoing down the hallways, bouncing off the walls in an unsettling symphony of fragmented sentences. At first, I thought I might be imagining it. After all, the mind can play tricks in such a heightened state of anxiety. But as I continued down the corridor, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. I recognized certain phrases. "You should have known. It's always been this way. And you're not the only one." My heart raced, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I tried to pinpoint the source of the voices. It was as if the hospital itself was speaking to me, urging me to remember something I had long forgotten. I turned a corner sharply, only to find a door standing ajar. It was different from the others. This one didn't have the usual cold, clinical look of the rooms I had passed. There was a faint light glowing from within, and I could hear the sound of movement from inside. I hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. What I saw inside made my stomach churn. The room was a grotesque mockery of a hospital ward, filled with rusted medical equipment and old, cracked furniture. But what caught my eye was the figure sitting in the corner, a woman hunched over, her back to me. She was muttering to herself, her hands trembling as she clutched a ragged piece of cloth. It was clear from her disheveled appearance that she had been here for a long time, possibly as long as I had been wandering through these halls. She was not alone. Several other figures stood in the shadows, watching me with hollow eyes. I felt a strange compulsion to approach her, though every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee. As I moved closer, the woman slowly raised her head, and my breath caught in my throat. It was the same woman from the mirror, the woman whose face had haunted me, whose presence had been my guide through the twisted corridors of this hospital. But now, her expression was not one of sorrow or longing. It was one of quiet resignation, as if she had accepted the truth I had been running from. "You've come back," she whispered, her voice raspy, as though it had been years since she had last spoken. Her eyes, once filled with pain, were now empty, as though she had seen too much, felt too much, and had finally surrendered to the madness that had overtaken the hospital. Her words seemed to carry weight, like a sentence I had been waiting for, but was too afraid to hear. "You know what must be done," she added, her voice barely audible. I froze, the reality of her words sinking in. I didn't know what she meant, but something deep inside me, a primal instinct, told me that I was on the verge of uncovering something far worse than I had imagined. I had come to the hospital searching for answers, for a way to escape the nightmares that had plagued me. But now, it seemed, the hospital itself had become my captor, and the answers I sought were beyond my reach. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, their words overlapping and tumbling over one another, their tone turning frantic. "It's not over," they chanted. "You're not free. None of you are free." My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my mind struggling to keep up with the overwhelming flood of thoughts and emotions. I was no longer sure who was speaking, whether it was the woman or the other figures in the room. Perhaps it didn't matter. I'd already lost track of what was real and what was just another manifestation of my fractured mind. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, the force of it causing the walls to shake. The woman stood up slowly, her movements unnatural, as if she were struggling against invisible chains. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in them. But then the moment passed, and her face hardened into a mask of indifference. "You were never meant to leave," she said softly, the words carrying the finality of a death sentence. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, as a feeling of cold dread washed over me. I had come to this hospital seeking answers, but the answers I had found were more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I was not a visitor here. I was part of something much darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of this place for far longer than I had realized. The woman, the people in the room, had all been trapped here for reasons that I couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. They were no longer the victims of the hospital. They had become a part of its twisted fabric, as inextricably linked to it as the very walls that surrounded us. As the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the lights flickered and dimmed, casting the room in eerie shadows. The hospital was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was closing in around me. The woman's hollow eyes never left me, as though she could see straight through me. The truth was slipping through my fingers, and yet I knew that I was now too deep, too entwined in the madness to ever escape. The tie that bound me to this place was undeniable. I had come for answers, but what I had found was far worse. The hospital was not just a place of suffering. It was a place of remembrance, a place where the ties to the past were never severed. And as I stood there, trapped between the past and present, I understood that the real horror was not the ghosts that haunted these halls, but the dark, unshakable truth that I would never be free of them. The air in the hospital had changed once again. Where it had once been suffocating, heavy with the oppressive weight of my fears and doubts, there was now a strange, almost palpable stillness. The whispers, which had once taunted me and whispered secrets, had faded into silence, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The woman's words echoed in my mind as I navigated the corridors, each step heavier than the last. You were never meant to leave. I had come to this hospital searching for the truth, but what I had discovered had broken me. The reflection in the mirror, the distorted images in my mind, the whispers from the shadows, all had led me to one undeniable conclusion. The hospital was not a mere building. It was a prison, a twisted force that fed on the suffering of those trapped within its walls. But it was not the hospital that had kept me here. It was the past, the inescapable truth that I had tried so desperately to bury. I had tried to fight it, to deny it, but now it was too late. The realization had consumed me. I was not just a visitor. I was a part of the hospital's dark history, a cog in the machine that had been operating long before I had arrived. The woman, the one who had guided me through this nightmare, had known this all along. She had been a part of it, just as I was now. We were both prisoners of the same twisted fate, unable to escape the grip of the past. The truth was simple, yet horrifying. I had come to the hospital as a patient once before, many years ago. I had been just like them, trapped, confused, and in pain. The memories had been buried deep within my mind, but now they had come rushing back. I had been part of the hospital's experiments, part of its sick game. I had been subjected to the same manipulations, the same distortions of reality that had claimed the others. And in that moment, I understood the true nature of the hospital. It was not a place for healing. It was a place for torment. I had been injected with something, a substance that had altered my perception of reality. It had blurred the line between what was real and what was a product of my mind. The reflections, the voices, the hallucinations, they were all a result of the drugs, of the experiments that had been conducted on me. But the worst part was the knowledge that I was not the only one. The others, those I had seen in the shadows, those who had been trapped here for so long, had all been part of the same experiment. They had all been manipulated, their minds twisted and warped by the hospital's cruel intentions. But even as I faced this terrifying truth, I felt a strange sense of calm. The realization had come too late, but it had come nonetheless. The past was unchangeable. I could not undo what had been done to me, nor could I undo the suffering of those who had come before me. But I could confront it. I could face the truth, even if it meant accepting that I would never leave this place. As I made my way to the room at the end of the hall, the room where it all began, I could feel the weight of the hospital pressing down on me. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been when I first entered. I stepped inside, the familiar sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. The room was the same as I remembered it, though it now felt colder, more oppressive. The bed where I had once lain, the machines that had monitored my every move, all stood in silent testimony to the horrors that had taken place here. The woman was waiting for me. She stood by the window, her back to me, as though she had been expecting me all along. She turned slowly, her face impassive, as if the years of suffering had erased all emotion from her features. "You've come back," she said, her voice soft, but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Was it pity, regret, or something darker? I nodded, though I had no words left. There was nothing more to say. The past was settled, and I had finally accepted the reality of my situation. There would be no escape. There was no freedom waiting for me outside those doors. I had come to the hospital seeking answers, but what I had found was a nightmare from which I could never wake. The woman stepped aside, her gaze lingering on me as though she, too, understood that there was no more to be done. "This is your home now," she said softly. "It always has been." I felt the weight of her words like a physical blow. The hospital had been my home before, in ways I had never understood. It had shaped me, molded me, just as it had done to so many others. And now, I was part of its twisted legacy, bound to its halls forever. The ties that had bound me to this place were too strong to break. As the door closed behind me, sealing me in once again, I realized that the hospital was not just a place of suffering. It was a place of memory. It remembered all those who had passed through its doors, all those who had been consumed by its darkness. It would never forget, and neither would I. The final diagnosis had been delivered, and I was just another patient, another lost soul wandering the sterile hallways of a hospital that had never been meant to heal. The whispers had stopped, but in their place, there was a terrible silence. A silence that would never leave me, no matter how hard I tried to escape it. The hospital was my home now, and I was its prisoner, forever.